My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. So, it is the policy of the Chinese Literature Podcast to never curse when speaking on this podcast. I try to keep my language measured and to use language that fits with the Brigham Young University Honor Code. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I spent a year or two at BYU studying Chinese. I was one of the 1.5% of non-Mormons there at BYU. However, despite the Chinese Literature Podcast policy, there are some times when I am required to curse. One exception to my no cursing podcast rule. If the author, speaking in Chinese, uses curse words, then I am not going to alter the author's original intention. Today's podcast is one of those exceptions. In this podcast, I am going to look at a poem by a sex worker or sex workers in Dalian. That's a city in what the Chinese refer to as Dongbei, that is the northeast, what in English has traditionally been called Manchuria. So I'm going to read this poem out in Chinese. I'm not going to bleep that, but when I read the English, I am going to bleep that out just to make sure that I'm keeping my iTunes clean podcast status. As I'm jumping into the poem, I just want to give fair warning to my more delicate listeners, which is actually a good segue into the poem itself. Some background on this poem. Today's poem I pulled from a book called Red Lights: The Lives of Sex Workers in Post-Socialist China. This is by Zheng Tiantian, a sociologist at SUNY Cortland. The book is about her research for her dissertation. Wow, what a dissertation this must have been. For her dissertation, she embedded at a cat house in Dalian, and she wrote up what happened. She herself never did sex work, but she was allowed to pretend like she was working as a prostitute without actually having to do any of the work. So that was her research. She is reporting on what these women see, what they do, and what is done to them, and how these women feel about all of this. I'm not going to discuss Professor Zheng's work too much, though I will say if anyone is interested in learning anything about sex work in China or issues of gender in China, they should take a look at this book. And as a literature nerd, what I found most fascinating about this book was some of the poems in it that the sex workers write. There were 3 in this book, and I think this one that I've selected today brings out a lot of interesting issues. So first, I'm going to read the Chinese. Again, I'm not going to bleep the Chinese. I'm only going to bleep the English. 进门笑嘻嘻，坐下像夫妻，消费已到手，处你妈了个逼. Okay, here's my translation of that poem. I enter the rule. All smiles, smiles. I sit down with you like we are husband and wife, but as soon as I get your money in my hand, I'm like, F your mama's. Okay, let's talk about this poem. So, first off, this poem, I'm going to put the Chinese and the English translation completely unedited. So I'm going to put all of that onto the website. Check out the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com, if you want to actually read the poem visually. So let's just break this poem down and see what is actually happening in this poem. This poem starts out with prostitutes entering the room. They're on display for the Johns, who are selecting the prostitutes that they are going to sleep with. I should point out, for those of y'all who aren't familiar with this terminology, a John is a man who pays for sex. Okay, back to the poem. These smiles that the prostitutes are smiling are completely 100% fake. That much is clear by the end of the poem. And that is actually the theme of the poem, fakeness, or probably a better word for that is performativity. Performativity is really just a technical word popularized by Judith Butler, my academic grandmother. Yes, I'm going to brag. That is, I studied under one of Judith Butler's students. Performativity, all that means is just essentially acting, like you're performing your role in society, the role that society expects of you. So these women are performing the role that is expected of them in society. So these women are coming into the room. They're part of this dance between prostitutes and Johns. The women come in, all smiles. I should first mention here two things. First, in Chinese, one of the ways one can say to go whoring is to say 买笑. That is literally to buy smiles. Of course, it's not just the smiles you're buying. Second, when I translated this poem, I added the subject I into it. The original Chinese, as is true of much Chinese poetry, does not have a subject. The subject is assumed. This doesn't really work in English. If you don't have a subject, it can be really kind of hard to understand a poem. In Chinese, that's not true. So when I translate it, I assume that the speaker of this poem, the person who's narrating the poem, is the sex worker. That's kind of a bit of a fudge. The poet could be I. The poet could be a we. That is, she could be writing in the name of all sex workers, or it could be her writing about one of her fellow prostitutes. In the original Chinese, it's not all that clear, but because I have to choose when writing in English, when translating into English, I'm going to assume that this is an individual sex worker. Okay, back to the poem itself. The poem's narrator talks about how she or they come in all smiling. She sits down next to the John as if she is the John's wife. The word in Chinese she uses is xiang. It's appearance, giving the appearance as if. The use of this word clearly signals that she is faking it, but she's trying to give the appearance of being husband and wife. Again, she's performing a role, but that highlights the performativeness of what's going on. In four-line poetry in Chinese, you frequently have the setup in lines 1 and 2, and then something shifts in lines 3 and 4, and the poem comes back around on itself. In this poem, we have that same classical Chinese poetic setup. What shifts is that she, the poet, the narrator, gets paid, and then she lets the John know what she really thinks. In other words, this poem has a lot of the elements of any traditional Chinese poem. Which actually brings me to another interesting point. I want to talk about the structure of this poem. Until the last line, this poem follows the traditional poetic model that Li Bai did in the previous episode that I did. The line is set up as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first two characters 1 and 2, deliver a thing that's happening, and then characters 3, 4, and 5 answer the first part of that line. Go back and look at the original Chinese if you speak any Chinese at all. As I said, I'm putting this up on the website. It's really worth it to take a look at the original Chinese. In that last line, the poet breaks all of the rules. She has 6 characters in the line, which is just, well, it's just weird. You're not supposed to do that. She's breaking the rules of Chinese poetry, and I really don't know how to understand this. In Chinese poetry, if you have a poem that's 5 characters per line like this, then you keep going with that all the way to the end. At first, I didn't know what to make of this, but as I read and reread this poem, I kind of wondered, is the poet using this break of the traditional rules of Chinese poetics to signal something larger? When the poet breaks the rhythm, is she also breaking her earlier voice that she adopted in this poem? In the beginning, she's this prim and proper wife, but she breaks that performance at the exact time when she busts the normal rules of traditional Chinese poetry. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it. I can't know, honestly, because I can't ask the poet. She's anonymous here. But I wonder, is this breaking of the rules of traditional Chinese poetry also about breaking the mask that she has adopted, the performativity that she has adopted in this poem? Is it about breaking that traditional wifely voice that she adopts in the beginning of the poem and at the beginning of the encounter with the John? I don't know, but if so, she is a very clever poet. The second thing I want to flag as really interesting in this poem is the way that she performs her femininity. The first line, she enters the room all smiling. Of course, that's a good tactic for anyone selling something. Smiling always sells better than frowning. But as those of y'all who are women and have been told by men that they need to smile more, as those of y'all who had this experience know there is this connection between femininity and smiling. That's true in China, that's true outside of China. But I think what's possibly uniquely Chinese is what happens in line 2. She sits down next to the John, all proper. I imagine her being very demure, crossing her legs, and what she does is she acts like a wife. This is not some highly sexualized performance. This is something much more modest. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I would not expect an American or a German or wherever those sex workers, I wouldn't expect them to perform their feminine role in this manner. I would expect something much more highly sexualized. I would not expect her to be like, "Hello, honey, welcome home. I baked some cupcakes." In another part of the book, Professor Zheng highlights the fact that most of these men are sleeping with these prostitutes because they're trying to get away from their wives. Apparently, a lot of these Johns in Dalian, when they need to go home to sleep with their wives, what they tell their prostitutes as an excuse is that they need to go, and I'm quoting, pay the grain tax. It's a very odd and very pejorative way to say you're going home to sleep with your wife. But this is what Professor Zheng documents. They speak of their sexual obligations to their wives as analogous to rendering unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. I don't know what to make of all of this. Is there something uniquely Chinese that makes this matrimonial performance sexually desirable, whereas in other parts of the world, sort of the discussions of sexuality is normally done quite distinct from discussions of marriage? I don't want to take that too far, but that's just something that I want to point out. Finally, I want to highlight the fact that these sex workers really hate the Johns that they are sleeping with. In that last line, it's one of the nastiest things you can say in Chinese. And the poet, she just lets it rip. Once she gets paid, she's like, and I'm not going to repeat the line, but it's interesting because she's angry at having to have sex with this John for money. But how does the poet insult the John? She doesn't say anything about the man himself. She insults his mama. Not only does she insult his mama, she insults his mama in the most feminine way possible. She sexualizes the mother and talks about her feminine parts. It strikes me as odd. If you wanted to suggest that this poem is a critique of patriarchal Chinese society, maybe, but that last line really undercuts anything like that. I mean, this last line is just, you can't make that fit with an entirely feminist reading of this poem. Okay, I'm guessing most of y'all have had enough of this poem. I thought it was interesting. As usual, like I said before, I will put both my translation and the original Chinese on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you want to learn more about sex work in China, check out Zheng Tiantian's Red Lights, The Lives of Sex Workers in Post-Socialist China. If y'all want to show your appreciation for my podcast, check out my Patreon site, patreon.com/Chinese Literature Podcast. Today's Chengyu is, of course, my xiao zhui huan. It literally means to purchase smiles and chase happiness. There are other versions of this Chengyu, my xiao xun huan. Pretty much the same thing. All of these things tie back to the same thing. They refer to buying smiles and chasing happiness, which means to go a-whoring. Okay, that's it for today's Chinese Literature Podcast. I am Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.